Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm Lauren Ingerman, and I lead Global Consumer Insights at Amazon Ads. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about one of our latest thought leadership research pieces called Beyond the Generational Divide. Now let me just figure out how to use this clicker. All right, there we go. So before we jump in, I'd love to start this presentation off with a little bit of a game called Guess the Generation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an agree-disagree statement from our research. And by a show of hands, I want you all to tell me which generation you think the responses belong to. Sound good? All right. 91% of which generation said that they believe everyone should have the freedom to be true to themselves. So raise your hand if you think this was Gen Z. Okay, quite a few. What about millennials? Okay. And what about Gen X? Okay, a few Gen X. And what about boomers? Okay, a few boomers. Nice. You might be surprised to know, maybe a couple of you weren't, but the answer is actually boomers. And this might be counterintuitive to you all because we tend to assign open-mindedness to younger generations, not necessarily older ones. 43% of this generation said that they make an effort to limit their use of screens and electronics. All right, raise your hand for Gen Z. Okay, quite a bit. What about millennials? Okay. What about Gen X? Okay, and what about boomers? Okay, I'm surprised by that. A lot of you actually got it right. It's Gen Z. And now I'll acknowledge that 43% is not a huge number, but Gen Z and millennials did score the highest on this particular statement. Okay, 79% of which generation said they do what they can to safeguard their financial future? Gen Z? Not many. Millennials? Okay, quite a few. Gen X? Even more. And boomers? Again, not so many. The answer is actually millennials. Now, what is one of the biggest stereotypes that we hear about millennials is that they're financially illiterate, right? They spend too much on avocado toast to know what they're doing with their finances, but as we can see here, the large majority of them are actually doing what they can to secure their financial future. And then our last one is 79% of which generation agree that we need to pay attention to the effects of climate change. All right, Gen Z? Okay, millennials? Gen X? Okay, you guys figured out the game. And boomers. All right, you guys figured it out. Yes, it's Gen X. But I think this is counterintuitive if we hadn't gone in that order. Because again, one of the biggest stereotypes we hear about Gen X is that they tend to be apathetic and cynical about the world. But again, in reality, we can see here that the large majority of them actually do care about things like climate change. So hopefully you guys all enjoyed that. And I like to start this presentation with that exercise because it really makes clear that so many of the assumptions that we hold about generations just aren't always accurate. So that begs the question then, why is everyone always talking about Gen Z? And before that, it was millennials. Pretty soon, it's going to be all about Gen Alpha, if it isn't already. Why is our industry so obsessed with age? Now, to understand this, I want to take a step back and talk to you about the generational paradigm. So every 15 years or so, a new generation is born, and generational theory categorizes people based on two things, based on birth year and based on shared historical experiences, whether those are cultural, political, or economic. And generational theory can be very useful because it allows us to bond with others who perhaps grew up similarly to how we did. We might be able to bond over the same TV shows we grew up with, or We experienced large historical moments at the same time in the same way. From a social science perspective, it can also be really useful because it allows us to compare the behaviors of different cohorts over time. Now, generational theory is also a problem because it assumes that people in the same generation also share the same attitudes, values, and behaviors. And sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes people in the same generation do share these traits, but it can also be very divisive to think that way. If we look at media headlines over the last several years, we can really see this illustrated. So for example, we used to hear that Gen Z is the most progressive generation ever, and now we're hearing that they're actually more conservative than we realized. Millennials prioritize work-life balance better than any other generation, but they're also the most burnt out generation. Boomers are inept with technology, but they're also highly engaged online. So which one is it? And what we're seeing is that between 2023 and 2024, there was a 36% increase in media headlines that spoke about generations in this way. So we're seeing society more than ever really leaning into this generational framework. And of course, everyone in this room knows that generational marketing has been a key component to advertising strategies for decades, whether it was reaching the coveted 18 to 34 demographic or just building creative that appeals to the youngest generation you're trying to reach. So for instance, today, we might be using Gen Z slang in our creative. And now I know what you guys are probably thinking, we do way more than demographic targeting. That's not all we do. And of course, demographics are only one part of the mix. We actually know that on average, advertisers use 3.6 different targeting strategies. So demographics are not going away, generations are not going away. And I'm not here to convince you of that. What I am here to hopefully convince you of, however, is that maybe we're still relying on generations and age a little bit too much. And ultimately, the question that we wanted to ask was, does the year we were born really define us? And that question is what led us to dig a bit deeper. So to do that, we worked with a research vendor called CrowdDNA on a mixed methods study across 11 different markets. I won't spend too much time on our methodology, but we took a 4-phased approach. We started with expert interviews. So we talked to marketers, economists, psychologists, and academics, all of who came with an expert perspective on generational theory and generational marketing. We did an online discourse analysis, some of which you saw a couple of slides ago. We did a consumer survey, and then we did in-depth interviews with consumers from different generations paired together. Now, I want to show you a video that I think really well sums up the research.
Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z. For decades, marketers have been obsessed with generational labels. But customers aren't connected by their birth year, they're connected by their passions. Our research proves audiences are more connected by their shared values, communities, and behaviors than by their generation. A 65-year-old gamer shares more common ground with a 25-year-old gamer than with non-gamers their own age. People supporting causes they care about connect across all ages. Streaming fans unite regardless of generation. When you focus on what unites instead of age brackets, that's where the magic happens. Messaging that resonates, creative that drives impact, connections that go deeper. Break free from generational divides. Reach more unified, relevant audiences. Build brand love. Because it turns out the saying is true. Age really is just a number. Passion is everything. With customizable, full-funnel advertising solutions and trillions of signals across streaming, shopping, and browsing, Amazon Ads helps you reach your most relevant customers throughout their day. Go beyond the generational divide with Amazon Ads.
Okay. So what did we learn then about how consumers perceive generational thinking? So as you saw in the video, for most consumers, age really is just a number. That's not just a cliche. The sentiment was equally felt, as we can see here, across all generations. 80% of consumers told us that they think their mindset defines them more than their age. 72% said their interests, hobbies, and passions define them more than their age. And 59% said that they find society's assumptions about their age should just be simply inaccurate. And this was really, really interesting because we asked respondents to select the generation that they identified with most, regardless of the one they were actually born into. And 1 in 4 surveyed consumers said that they identified with a generation that was different than the one they were born into. And so this really just further highlights the relatively arbitrary nature of age-based cohorts. So what do consumers then have to say about advertising in particular? Well, we can see here, again, 3 in 5 consumers in every generation think that brands just try too hard to appeal to certain age groups. Now, to me, that's a direct call to action for brands to do things differently. And we have a really great quote from one of our experts. His name is Ya Awusu. And he said, taking a generation-first approach really just separates people into boxes. Me and my mom are both aspirational people. There's no reason that one brand can't speak to the both of us. And this idea that one brand can speak simultaneously to multiple generations, we're seeing is true across pretty much every advertising category. Most consumers, as we can see here, well over 60%, want to see more ads that reflect the shared human experiences that bring people together, regardless of their age. And this sentiment remains consistent across recent shoppers in more than a dozen categories. So what's next, right? What can you guys all do to live up to this expectation? To understand that, we conducted a correlation analysis using over 1,000 variables from our survey, which quantified the like-mindedness of different groups of people. And what we found through this analysis is that respondents who shared similar behaviors, communities, and values were more like-minded or more unified than consumers who were simply part of the same generation or age group. They were 2.1 times more unified by their behaviors, 2.2 times more unified by their communities, and 1.4 times more unified by their values. So what we're proposing is that brands move away from viewing audiences like this to really understanding what unites them, right? To focusing on the core values that transcend generations, to focusing on the shared communities that bring us together across generations and our cross-generational networks of influence. And to focus on shared behaviors where marketers can define audiences based on actual measurable signals instead of just broad generalizations. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the data that supports all of this. So starting with behaviors. So what we did here is we looked at 60 different behaviors across each of these different activity categories. And we found, again, that in most cases, respondents were more than 2 times more similar based on the weekly activities they engage with versus how old they are. So let's take physical activities as an example. So in our survey, physical activities included things like playing different types of sports, going hiking, biking, running, etc. And the data shows us that people who share those interests are 2.5 times more alike than people who happen to belong to the same generation. And now for communities. So as we know, our communities have the ability to shape us in really profound ways. And one of the experts we spoke to, who is a cultural historian, his name is Louis Menand, he said that, quote, social groups like family and friends tell us what's important in life and what we should value, end quote. And that's really true. But our communities actually aren't just our friends and family. They can also be the creators and influencers that we engage with every day. And our data shows us that across generations and across all activity categories, most people say that their communities influence their behaviors and their decisions. Now, I'll acknowledge there is a slight generational trend here. We do see that younger consumers are a bit more likely to be influenced. But the idea here is that the impact of community is really important for marketers to consider across all age groups. And now for values. We asked respondents to agree or disagree with more than 40 statements, some of which you saw earlier in the presentation. Now, there will always be certain ways of seeing the world and moving through the world that are unique to certain generations, right? We can't deny that. But what we can see here is that our core values like striving to build a happy life, or maintaining supportive relationships, or being financially stable, these are all things that people of all ages hold to relatively similar degrees. They really are what makes us all human. So for example, 77% said that they want to leave the world better than they found it. Now, different generations are undeniably going to go about achieving that differently, but the value itself is the unifying factor, right? So we really think that value should serve as the North Star for advertisers as you're starting to develop messaging. And so we've seen how these three forces unite consumers more powerfully than age, right? Behaviors that reveal what they do, communities that shape how they connect with each other, and values that define really what matters to them. And entertainment is where we think these forces really all intersect. And here we can see that broken down by entertainment type. So think about your favorite TV show, your favorite movie, your favorite podcast, video game. It probably reflects your values in some way. It probably influences your behavior to some degree. And there's probably a community of passionate fans surrounding that thing that you might be a part of yourself. So these connections are really, really valuable for consumers and advertisers alike. And the best part of all of this is that we actually know it works. We looked at Amazon's first-party data, and what we found is that campaigns that used both age and interest-based targeting strategies together saw a 1.5x increase in page views, in add-to-cart rates, and to purchase rates. And when we isolated just video campaigns, we saw even greater performance. So to wrap up, I will leave you all with a few key takeaways. Age is just a number, and consumers agree that brands need to start thinking differently. Brands have the opportunity to reach audiences, again, based on the values, behaviors, and communities that unite them, and this can be done through the entertainment that they love. And we know that when advertisers do engage consumers in this way, that it actually works. Thank you, everyone.